Good evening, everyone. I'm Ellen Whitaker, and welcome you on behalf of the Lee Historical Society to tonight's talk. We're pleased to present author John Dickson, who is here as part of our 2024 speaker series. John's interest in history sprung at a young age, as both his undergrad and graduate work focused on history. He served in the U.S. Foreign Service before retiring here in the Berkshires. He is an author, a volunteer guide at Arrowhead and also in the Berkshire Woods. He also chairs the Pittsfield Historical Commission. He's written 2 books and is currently working on a book about Melville. He is here tonight to tell us about Melville's attraction to the Berkshire Hills of his day and how this interest made its way into the books that he wrote. We invite you to stay after to meet with John and enjoy some refreshments. And please take home a membership application to our Historical Society.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. I recognize a number of faces, including a fellow guide from Arrowhead and Historical Society friends, and even someone who helped me put my computer back together so that I could come here easily tonight. So as Ellen said, I've been doing tours at Arrowhead for 10 years. I used to call it my obsession, chasing Melville, because it's kind of like Ahab chasing the white whale. But now I call it my pastime, my retirement hobby. And about a year ago, those 2 things. If you can't, I'm a kind of a low talker. I start drifting. If you can't hear, raise your hand. Good. And but maybe later on you won't be able to. So and the other is interrupt me. Just raise your hand and ask a question. I don't mind. Especially if there's something on the screen. I don't want to go. We can go back, but if there's something on the screen you want to talk about, let's talk about it while it's on the screen. So I don't mind interruption. I don't have a prepared talk. As I said, I've been doing Melville for over 10 years, and so it's kind of all up here. Unfortunately, it doesn't leave a lot of room for other stuff. And I told my wife today I got to get rid of the Melville stuff to get more other stuff in here. Anyway, about a year ago, it happened a long time ago. I was struck by places around the Berkshire County where Melville had gone. In fact, the Historical Society at Arrowhead had put up a Melville trail. There were posters around the county. I don't know if anybody has seen any of them. But there's one right across from my house. So I knew about that. And so I knew Melville had been around. And the more I looked into it, and I thought, well, he's really been around. He's been all over. And then I put 2 and 2 together. I mean, Melville is a wanderer. His protagonist, his narrator in Moby Dick is Ishmael, the great wanderer in the Bible. And I think, and Marilyn, you can disagree with me, I think Ishmael is Melville. And because he says, call me Ishmael, well, he's really saying, call me Ishmael, but my real name is Herman Melville. That's what I think he's saying. I don't know. Anyway, so he's a wanderer, and he wandered as a young man over to the Pacific, all the way to Hawaii and Tahiti, 4 years at sea, and wandered out to the Mississippi River. At one point, wandered to Europe, and then he came to the Berkshires in 1850 at the age of 30, and then bought a house here at the age of 31, just a couple of months later. And what did he do here? He wandered around the Berkshires. And so I started reading this 2-volume biography by Herschel Parker, who has read every letter that had the word Herman Melville in it, and has put it in this 1,700-page biography. And about a month ago, I read a talk he gave saying, wouldn't it be great, as I was well into this project of writing about Melville's wanderings around Berkshire County, he said, wouldn't it be great if the Historical Society put together a book of Herman Melville, where he went to in Berkshire County and all the places with current maps and photos. So that's my project that I'm hoping will be finished quite soon. And as I started this, I went to the usual places. And the usual places are Arrowhead and the Melville Room at the Pittsfield Public Library. And in the Melville Room at the Pittsfield Public Library is a book in a glass case that Melville bought when he came up here in the summer of 1850. And the book is History of Berkshire County, written by David Dudley Field from Stockbridge. And Melville bought that book when he came up in July of 1850. And in the front of the book is a map, a fold-out map of Berkshire County. And he used that book as a reference to his introduction, I believe, to Berkshire County.
He came in 1850. He was 30 years old.
He was 30 years. He moved here at age 31. He actually first came to Pittsfield at age 11.
How did he get enough money to buy the house if he was one?
He didn't have money. He borrowed it. He had already written 5 books, and they were all about the sea, those 5 books. He was living in Manhattan. He wrote 2 of his books in Albany. And everybody heard his question? How did he, right? He didn't have any money. He borrowed the money to buy that house. He had started writing this book about a whale. He was so inspired by what he saw here. He set aside the first draft of that and rewrote it from page 1 up at Arrowhead. He was so sure that this would make him wealthy. He actually wrote to a friend saying he was going to retire, a gentleman farmer in Berkshire County, and it would make him so wealthy, this book about a whale. That didn't happen. Anyway, so this is just a quick map. The Melville Farm was the first place he went to. Marilyn knows, but anybody else know what the Melville Farm is? That's actually the country club of Pittsfield now. As you're driving into Pittsfield, it's a premier. And so the clubhouse, the northern third of that clubhouse was the house that he first visited when he was 11 years old. And it belonged to his Uncle Thomas, his father's brother. And Uncle Thomas had come out here during the War of 1812 to run a prisoner of war camp in downtown Pittsfield, right where Maplewood Avenue is, and Dottie's Cafe, if you know St. Joe's Church in that area. So Melville Farm is the country club area. He then stayed on and taught school 1 year at a place called Sykes District School, and then would wander up to Ashley Lake, which is our great reservoir now. Monument Mountain and the Ice Glen we'll talk about is another place that he went to before he moved here. Shaker Village he went to before he moved here, Hancock Shaker Village and the New Lebanon Shaker Village. He had a wife and an 18-month-old son when he moved here. His mother and 3 sisters also moved into the Arrowhead with him. Tanglewood is what we know of Tanglewood as a performance center, but Tanglewood was the name that Nathaniel Hawthorne gave the area, and his little red house was on the grounds of Tanglewood. The site is still there. There is a little red house. It's not Hawthorne's house. That is owned by Tanglewood. Finally, he bought the house next door to the Melville family farm, called it Arrowhead because he found Indian relics as he was digging in the ground. He went to Balance Rock shortly after moving in. Constitutional Hill in Lanesboro. Anybody know this? I never knew Constitution. Oh, you do? Good. There is a memorial at the. No, it's the. It was a memorial. It's called Constitution Hill because one of the people who voted from Massachusetts to sign the Constitution was from Lanesboro, and they had a big festival on the hill, and so they called it Constitution Hill. Am I right?
They had a big fire went out, and they signed it.
Okay.
Lit the big fire in the city. So you were close.
Close. Okay. Are you from Lanesboro?
I wasn't.
Oh, okay. Good. It's a great hike up there now. There's some interesting pictures. I didn't put them in here, but you can see Constitutional Hill in 1851 when he went there had no trees on it. Now it's just fully wooded, but back then they had clear-cut most of New England. Pontusic Lake, he went to. A friend said Herman goes, whenever he goes to Pontusic Lake, he's charmed anew. Right? There's something about the lake. Mount Greylock, finally, he goes up after Mount Greylock. After he'd been watching and looking at Mount Greylock, observing, admiring Mount Greylock for many years, he then went to the Hoosick Tunnel, the eastern portal of the Hoosick Tunnel as they were building it, and finally to Bash Bish Falls. So look at the map. Well, he did come to Lee, just so I don't want to get that out right away, but he didn't write about it. He probably wrote about it, maybe in letters, or his sisters did, but he came to Lee to buy paper because an author needs paper, and so he would come down here. He also went to Dalton to buy paper, but he did go around up to Savoy and Monterey as well, but I didn't put them in here. Yes? They did not have typewriters. And so if you go to Arrowhead, which you haven't because you would know the answer. Oh, you have? You would have seen a feather pen on his writing table. And when he was writing, feather pens had gone out of style and people were using stylus pens, but he continued to use a feather pen well past when anybody else. And I don't know why. I can guess. I think he writes fast, and it forces him to slow down to think about what he's going to write next. What do you think, Marilyn? Yeah? You can disagree. Yeah.
There's at least two writers who wander all over the town, and their stuff winds up in the newspaper. Why didn't Melville stuff go into the newspaper?
So it did indirectly. He had many visitors come here, and they were mostly his friends from Boston and New York. He made only a few friends here. And for those of us from the Berkshires, we know what it's like to be swamped by people from Boston and New York. Well, that was Melville, quite frankly, as I learn more about him. He made one very good friend here. His name was J.E.A. Smith. He was the editor of the Berkshire Eagle, who was himself a published author and poet. And so Smith wrote about, he wrote two histories of Pittsfield, but he also wrote portrayals of authors and artists in the Berkshires. Melville turned when he was towards the end of his time in Pittsfield. He was here 13 years. He started writing poetry. And poetry, for him, was an art, a form that he wanted to practice and get good at, quite frankly. But poetry he could also sell, because back then, the front pages of newspapers would often have poems on them. And you don't see that today, but Melville could sell his poems to newspapers. He did quite a bit of, his short stories appeared in magazines as well, serialized. So there's the extent. And here's the family farm. This is that northern third of the country club right now. When Herman came out here as an 11-year-old with his father and his mother and his older sister. And Thomas Melville was living in here. He had his children, one of whom was Priscilla, Herman's cousin, who said Herman's first love was the Berkshire farm. He fell in love. He had been in Albany. He grew up in New York City. His father went bankrupt. They fled to Albany. They were in Albany for a year. And during that year, when his father was still alive, his father died 1 year after getting to Albany. They came out to Pittsfield. They were heading towards Springfield, but they stopped and saw his father's brother here. And Herman fell in love with the Berkshires at that point as an 11-year-old. And it was a profound, forever feeling or romance that he had with this area. In 1850, he came back, and he was showing people around the family farm. And his editor, one of whom he was being shown around what we now know as the country club, said, Herman knows every rock and bush on the Berkshire farm. And so what that means to me is, what did this young boy do when he came to the family farm? As I did growing up in the rural area, you took off in the morning and you wandered into the woods and you pretended you played games or whatever. But Herman would point out rocks and said, this was the rock where I would sit and gaze at Mount Greylock. And so I went up to the country club. I snuck in. Oh no, it's too late. Don't tell them it's on. Anyway, I did come in from Arrowhead. It was winter time, and I wanted to see what it was that Herman saw when he was there that wasn't a golf course. And so I went to the highest point on the country club, the golf course, and this is what he saw. And this was also the view he had from the family farm. He was upstairs in that house, and he could see Mount Greylock and the company Saddleball Mountain, the two of them saddleback. This was his view. This was what he one of the things he fell in love with was this view. I should say the other thing down here you can barely see is Moorwood Lake. It's a small lake on the country club. The golf course doesn't really go by the lake. It was called Melville Lake when the Melvilles lived there. The people who bought it from the Melvilles were Moorwood Lake. And Herman would go down there, and in Moby Dick, in the very first page, he says, meditation and water go hand in hand. So you can imagine that this young boy just sitting by the lake, throwing rocks in and thinking. Obviously, Melville then went on to the Pacific Ocean, and he was looking out at real water, expansive water, to meditate upon. So in July of 1850, he came back for a vacation. He was in New York City. He had almost finished this book about a whale. He comes up to visit his cousin, now owned the farm. His uncle had died. His cousin greets him at the train station and says, sorry, Herman, I sold the farm. You sold my first love. And don't worry, stay with us. It's a boarding house, and the owners haven't taken possession. What he did with his cousin was on the agricultural committee of Berkshire County, and they went on a trip. They hopped in a carriage. His cousin was going to do an agricultural report for the committee on the state of agriculture in southern Berkshire County. And what does Herman Melville do? He says, I'll come along. I want to explore. And that's when he bought that book that I showed you from David Dudley Field. And that was the map that they must have used to get around. How do they get around? They don't have GPS. They probably stop and ask people. His cousin had lived here his whole life. His cousin probably knew some of the ways, but they went all the way down through Stockbridge, over to Egremont, all the way down to Ashley Falls. And again, Herman is writing, and he writes a little in that book about his trip. A few weeks later, David Dudley Field Jr., the son of the person who wrote that history book, hears that Melville's in the area, knows that other authors are around, and so he says, let's get them all together, all these people who are up from New York and out from Boston, and let's go have a picnic. And so 10 people converge at David Dudley Field's house in Stockbridge, and they all get there, they're all dressed up for a picnic. Oh, we're going to have the picnic at the top of Monument Mountain. And so two women went on the hike, and they're wearing these long flowing robes, and men are wearing patent leather shoes. Oliver Wendell Holmes is there. And the other person of note for history is Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had moved to Lenox in March of 1850. After writing Scarlet Letter, he had to get out of Salem because Scarlet Letter is not too complimentary about Salem. So he's renting this house. And this is where, on Monument Mountain, where Hawthorne and Melville meet on this hike up the mountain. They meet and they chat, and I call it America's most famous literary hike because it changed the way Melville. It was the first step for Melville to think, oh, I'm going to put that draft of a book about whale aside, and I'm going to incorporate the things that Hawthorne and I are talking about. Because after the hike, Hawthorne invited him back to his house, and Herman went over there. Hawthorne later wrote and said, Herman Melville came over. We talked until the early morning hours. We talked about time and eternity, this world and the next, books and publishing, all things possible and impossible. When was the last time you had a conversation like that? Yeah.
You know whether Melville had read Hawthorne's work.
So, after this hike, Melville returns with his editors from New York City, who says somebody needs to write a review of Hawthorne's Tales from, was it the Old Manse, or, and so, pardon me? Not that one, but there was one called the Tales from an Old Manse. There were stories that Hawthorne had written, and so Melville sits down in the room at the Melville farm, looking at Greylock, and starts writing this incredibly glowing review of Hawthorne as the next Shakespeare. I don't know if he had read anything of Hawthorne before that, but immediately he fell in love with the intellect of Hawthorne at this time. They went back to David Dudley Field's house, and they went after a 4-hour supper, or meal in the middle of the day, with a lot of, and actually they were drinking champagne on the top of Monument Mountain. They drank more at lunch. Somebody suggested, let's go right behind David Dudley Field's house is this ice glen. Anybody been to the ice glen before? And you know, the reason it's called the ice glen is presumably it's such a deep and steep ravine that there's ice all year long there. I went there in April and saw a little ice, but I was more worried about all the crevices and bears being there. Oh, I don't think I should be here. Anyway, it's really a magnificent place. And this place was on the cover of Smithsonian Magazine last January 2023, because somebody had found that there was old growth forest in the ice glen, and there were trees that were 300 or 400 years old. The loggers couldn't get into this area to cut, and so there was old growth. Well, so Melville at some point starts rewriting a few months later, or a few weeks later, he starts rewriting Moby Dick, and somewhere in the middle of the book appears the ice glen. Moby Dick, he's describing a whale that is beached on an island in the South Pacific, and he's saying the wood behind was just spectacular. It was green as mosses of the icy glen. The trees stood high and haughty. These are the 300-year-old trees that he saw filling their. So he's using the ice glen to talk about the South Pacific. How many people you think who read Moby Dick know what the ice glen is? Or icy glen as it was called? Nobody. But does Melville care? No, he does not care. He packs so much in every page. He doesn't care if you know it or not. But anyway, I was struck by seeing this in Moby Dick. So this is that same map of the trip that he took to go have a picnic with Hawthorne and Oliver Wendell Holmes, and this is what interests me as much as anything else. It's a 54-mile trip, a round trip. He did it in one day, and he did it. Well, all the logistics are just incredible to me. This guy, David Dudley, how does he invite people? You know, he sends out a messenger with invitations here or there, and he sees a couple of people on the train coming back from New York. You want to come? Yeah, I'll come. And they all show up, again, not knowing that they're going to hike up a mountain. Well, how does Melville get there and home in one day? He takes the train. He goes from the Pittsfield Country Club, goes into center of town, hops on the train, and I went to the Pittsfield Public. This is the only original research I did in the whole, all of it. So in the whole project was I found the train schedule from 1850. One train from Pittsfield to New York, one train from New York to Pittsfield. The first train, the only train, leaves Pittsfield at 8 a.m., stops in Stockbridge, and half an hour later. On the way back, it stops in Stockbridge at 10 p.m. So there's Melville. This is the only train. This is how he got there and got back. But what did he do in the meantime? He hiked up a mountain, had a 4-hour lunch, went to the ice glen. After the ice glen, they had another dinner, and then he's obviously telling his hosts, "There's a train coming. We got to get on the train." So he gets it. He and Oliver Wendell Holmes and the two editors, George and Everett Dyke, run to the train station, get on the train, and head back to Pittsfield. The train stopped right next to the country club so that they wouldn't go all the way into town, and he could hop out. Oliver Wendell Holmes could hop out and go across the street to his house. Not really earth-shattering stuff, but to me, that I love that. So 6 weeks after that hike, Melville has bought this house next door to the country club. It abuts, the property abuts the country club, and this is Arrowhead. This is it today. This is when the Historical Society bought it. People had, non-Melvilles were living there for 50 years. When Herman left Arrowhead in 1863, he sold the house to his younger brother. And his younger brother and his family stayed in there till 1927, and they used it as a summer retreat. And here's another picture of it. Yes.
Back to my book.
Okay.
There are a lot of rumors.
Yeah.
What's a pocket that's not in terms of Hawthorne and Melville.
Romantic rumors.
Yeah.
There are a lot of rumors. There's no. One guy wrote a book about, and some of the letters that have remained. None of the letters from Hawthorne to Melville survived. Letters that Melville wrote to Hawthorne have survived, and some of them are really so flowery, it leads one to believe that Melville had romantic feelings for. You know what? When Melville left Pittsfield in 1863, he had a big bonfire outside the Arrowhead barn. He burned all of his drafts, all of his letters, and so as a result, people are making stuff up. They're guessing and speculating, and that this is one of the speculations that some people feel very strongly about one way or the other. Pardon me? He said to, actually, Julian Hawthorne came to visit him in Melville, when Melville had moved back to New York City and his father had died, and Julian was writing a book. And Julian said he had all of the letters that Herman had written his father, and Melville was shocked and was worried that he did not want to, those were to your father, they're not public, they're private. But Julian used them in the there's one quote that I kind of remember paraphrasing, "I'm drinking from the cup that touched your lips." That kind of flowery language that might mean something else today than what they could have used there. Hawthorne was 15 years older than Melville. Hawthorne was this erudite transcendentalist, Bowdoin College. Melville was a 6th grade dropout. He dropped out of school at 12. This is a wonderful picture of Arrowhead drawn by Herman. In 1860, Herman had taken a trip to San Francisco with his brother, who was a captain of a ship, and so they decide, let's go off to China. And so Herman goes on the ship with his brother, and he gets to San Francisco and gets homesick. And so he sends, he returns home. and again, the logistics of him writing a letter to his family from how does it get home before he does? But this was a letter to his children saying, I can't really, a drawing of Arrowhead, I can't wait to see you again. Here I am coming up in my carriage, and here's your mother, and two of you are in the road waiting to greet me. A wonderful little Melville doodled. But what I like about this particularly is this. These are the paths that Melville wandered on a daily basis. And he remembered them and he put them in there. This one went over to the Melville family farm and was a road. It was passable in the summer. But he would hike up here. His wife said later in life that Herman would go out in the morning, every morning, and go for a walk. And this was where he would go up and walk most of the time. Yes?
The trail of that you can do, is that one of these trails?
No. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. So there is a trail into the woods. It's a little loop trail. It goes over by the Pittsfield Country Club and does a loop. You can see the country club when there's no foliage, but it's just a trail that, but it could have been. I mean, how close was it? Kind of goes like this and around. We're going to see this a couple of times later. And what Melville liked about Arrowhead was it had the exact same view that he could see from the country club. And somebody else wrote a book about another love affair that Melville supposedly had. And if he said if Melville really was in love with Hawthorne, he wanted to be near Hawthorne, he would have moved to Lenox. No, Melville chose this house. He only looked at one house when he decided to move here. And I am 99.9% convinced, guessing, speculated, the reason he chose this house was he wanted the same view. It was his inspiration. And what he wrote to his editor right after moving in, it's wintertime, it's early November, he pushes his writing table up against the study window and he says, Dear Everett, I have a sort of sea feeling here in the country now that the ground is covered with snow. It reminds me of looking out a ship's portal. And what he saw, this is a picture I took here in winter. He didn't see trees, just like the picture that, the drawing that he had. Most of New England had been clear cut for the wood, for the timber, for the firewood and charcoal. But it was this long plateau going up, and that was his sea. He had been surrounded by the sea when he was writing in Manhattan. He found his sea here. This was his inspiration. But it's more than just the sea that he sees, and this is our famous climax of the tour. He sees a white whale up there when he's looking, and he puts it in the last page of the last line of the first chapter, which is why we know he rewrote Moby Dick, is a line that could only have been written looking at this view. He says, I'm going out to the Atlantic to hunt whales, where there are endless processions of the whale, and mid most of them all, one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. And there's that snow hill in the air. And people, when I say that on the tour, I don't know about you, they kind of wince. Yeah, really, where's the whale? Fast forward to the first day of the chase, towards the end of the book. Ahab climbs the mast. Ahoy! Look, there's the whale. A snow hill in the air. It's Moby Dick. It's Moby Dick. So that's his inspiration while he's there. He loved Greylock. He loved Greylock, yes.
But again, that not worse than bear.
Yes. And pardon me?
The hopper has two scales.
Okay.
All the Greylock is bear.
Well, I think it's most of these mountains were barren up to much farther than today, much farther. Once they started getting steep, the wagons couldn't go up. In fact, Nathaniel Hawthorne came out here to give a Williams College commencement address. And the guy who took him around said, I was the first person to go up there in a wagon. So it's not totally accessible. There are farms around there, and you're right that a lot of this area has been clear cut. And you'll see in a couple of the other pictures. Melville liked that view so much he built a porch on the wrong side of the house. It's too small. Should be on the south side. He's got 7 people living with him. They can't sit on that porch. He doesn't care. He just wants one chair there so he can look outside at the view. And he puts a rocker out there. And in 1856, he writes a story that ends this way. It's a wonderful story, and I'll probably spoil it for you. But he ends, I stick to the piazza, it's my box royale, and this amphitheater, my theater of San Carlo. The scenery is magical, the illusion is so complete. He has gone up the mountain to see this. There's something on the mountain that's sparkling. Turns out to be a young woman living up there, almost as a hermit. And she says to him, I wonder who lives down the valley in that beautiful house. How fortunate that person is. And this man, 1856, Melville, was not feeling very fortunate. He's looking up at the mountain thinking this is a fairy castle. And so he says, oh, I prefer the piazza than where she is. So I said I would come back to this picture of Melville, and I mentioned that he went on walks. He writes a short story later in the 1850s called about a rooster that crows too loud and wakes him up all the time. He's hell-bent on finding that rooster, and so, but he says, and I like this because it's a little bit of Melville's frame of mind after Moby Dick failed, after some of his other books did not sell as well as he wanted. It was, my own private affairs were full of despotisms, casualties, and knockings on the head. One early morning in spring, being too full of hypos to sleep, I sallied out to walk on my hillside pasture. Why did he walk? I think he walked for mental health as well. Hypos would be depressions, and I mentioned he went to Shaker Village in Hancock, or that straddles the Pittsfield-Hancock border. He also went all over to the Lebanon, New Lebanon Shakers, which was the headquarters of the Shaker community at the time, and he knew the Shakers from Albany as well. This is what Hancock would have looked like. Here's the roundstone barn, a very different barn. They raised the roof after Melville had first seen it. But guess what? He puts the Shakers in Moby Dick as well. And so he's got a character. There's a character. They have this, they called them gams, when 2 boats at sea would meet, and they exchange letters, exchange news. Have you seen? And obviously, what Ahab's asking was, "Have you seen the white whale?" And on board the other ship is a crazy man, named Gabriel. That Melville says he'd been originally nurtured among the crazy society of the Nescayuna. This was the original name of the Shakers in Albany, Nescayuna. And in fact, near the Albany airport, you can see signs for Nescayuna. Nescayuna Shakers, where he had been a great prophet. And then Gabriel finds out, Ahab's asking about the white whale, and he says, oh, the white whale is no less a being than the Shaker god incarnated. He's predicted speedy doom to the sacrilegious assailants of divinity. Does Ahab heed him? No, we all know that. A couple of months later, he heads over to Balance Rock. Anybody been to Balance Rock in Lanesboro? Okay. Yeah, you went with me. It does not look like this. Now it's forested. But when Melville went, It was open and bare. What I like about this picture, this was taken probably decades, late 1800s, well after Melville had been there. But I like, if you've been to Balance Rock, you've seen graffiti. So the graffiti is, nobody likes it on the rock, but it's historical. People have been chiseling and putting their names in that rock forever, painting on it. There's a rumor that Melville wrote one of these other books is about a romance between Melville and Sarah Morwood, the woman. Am I going on too long? Is this what? You sure? Okay. Because I could keep talking and talking. Anyway, rumors of a romance between Sarah Morwood and Herman Melville. Sarah was the one who bought the house, the family farm from the next door to Arrowhead. And so she was a lively, social person, and they went over there. And the rumor is that Herman put H.M. and S.M. on a tree, chiseled it in. Obviously, you can't see it now if it was on a tree. But which tree? There aren't trees. So. But, and of course, Balance Rock makes its way into the next book that Melville's writing. And he does just a remarkable description of this rock. And if you've seen it, it's just this huge, huge boulder on a little fulcrum. And you have to wonder, why is it not? Well, when Melville went out there with a group, Sarah Morwood had made a picnic, and she brought a little a music box that she hid under the rock, and so there was music coming out of it. Well, that made its way into the book as well. But look at this. I love everything about this. The detail of the description is incredible, but it gets to, it doesn't lose sight of the awe of the rock. It was a breathless thing to see. And then he does what we all wonder as we're looking at this rock. It's almost as if you could just drop a seed on it and it would fall over. Some point it's going to fall over. I don't know when. The Man on the Mountain in New Hampshire fell off. This one, who knows? Anyway, the next book Melville writes after Moby Dick is, yes? Yeah. He's self-taught. He is self-taught from that point on. I think, and Marilyn disagree with me, I think a lot of this language is overcompensating. I'm trying to get in his mind. I'm making it up. But he was at sea. He said in Moby Dick, he said, the whaling ship was my Harvard College and Yale. In what way? Well, he certainly learned a lot on these experiences of sailing and whaling and adventures, but he also, these ships had libraries. And so certainly when he finally got to Honolulu to get home, he joined the Navy, and they have the contents of the library that was on that Navy frigate. And so he read widely. But this is my trick at Arrowhead if you ever go on a tour with me. We get up to the library, to his study, and I open up a book. I open up the book to any page, and there's stuff on that page you've never heard of before. Some reference to Persian mythology. Here, I took it out. He says these rocks are like Memnon. I took it out because I knew nobody would know. What's Memnon?
Agamemnon?
No. Memnon were two colossal statues in Egypt, out of which there was music. You could hear music, supposedly. So why did Sarah Morwood put the music box under the boulder? Because of Memnon. Now, where did he get Memnon? How did this sixth grader know about Memnon in Egypt? He reads. Certainly the Bible. Everybody knew the Bible inside and out, and Moby Dick is littered with biblical references. Paradise Lost? Who's read Paradise Lost? I did last year for the first one. Moby Dick is littered with Paradise Lost and the fight between the devil and the. But I think there are a couple things with his autodidact. One is his older brother had finished high school. His older brother helped him. This is what you need to know to be a gentleman. And so from that, he went off and was good at it. Pardon me? His family was, and but I don't. I mean, I say, and Hawthorne, either Hawthorne or his wife said he's the most spiritual man I know. But he didn't go to church. He had doubts. And I think the doubts came from his voyages and seeing how other people worship, both in the islands and other faiths. Why do we have and he saw the missionaries in Hawaii, he wrote about the missionaries in a way that we would write about the missionaries. Are they doing any good? Moby Dick, he says, I'd rather sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunk Christian. That didn't go over well. Anyway. So here's the Pontusic Lake, and there's the poster of the Melville Trail. And I think I said this already, that Sarah Moore came up here with Melville and others, and she said every time Herman comes to this lake, he sees a new charm. And guess what? Towards the end of his life, after he died, a number of poems came to light that were unpublished. And he had written these shortly before he had died. The last time he came to Berkshire County, he died in 1891. He left Pittsfield in 1863. I counted 6 times he came back. Did he go to Pontusic Lake? I don't think so. And he writes this poem towards the end of his life, and he remembers exactly what he saw, the pillared pines in well-spaced order, like an open temple show, all the way up to the fields, pastoral fields, and barns appear. Further fainter mountains keep hazed, and it's a long poem as well. But a couple of things about the poem and Melville's genius. One of the things about the genius is, I think his genius is his memory and his ability to recall. So that he would have read something about Memnon, in the equivalent of National Geographic as a kid. He tucked it away here, and he remembered it just like this. He probably hadn't seen Pontusic Lake in 30 years, but he remembers it as well as I do, and I live across the street from this. He went up to Ashley Lake. Ashley Lake is a reservoir for Pittsfield now. It's up in Washington Mountain, the town right east of Pittsfield, where Dreamaway Lodge is and October Mountain, and you can go up there, and the Appalachian Trail cuts right through there, and walk around Ashley Lake, which I did. But Melville writes about, because he had gone to this school district in the foothills of the mountains there, and then the Sykes family ran a logging company and farm up the mountain. We now know as Sykes Mountain. So he knows the eastern, what we call the hill towns, and he writes in a book, he wrote at Arrowhead about the roughest roads of the Berkshire Hills. He's saying that, why rush? People are in a rush to get everywhere by train. Why not, enjoy ample food for poetic reflection in the singular scenery of the country? It's scenery we all know, and this is why we're here. And he has also seen the same. That to me is what's most interesting, is this scenery that we see almost every day in one form or another is what inspired him to write such beautiful things. He did go, and he had to buy paper. First winter he was here, he ran out of paper, and so he took his family, they hopped in a sled and went over to Dalton to buy paper. Later on, he came to Lee to buy paper. He writes, as pointed out earlier, this wonderful story of the daughters of Tartalos in this is the Crane Mill. Most of you will recognize this stone mill here. This is what used to be the Crane Museum. The papermaking museum is now shut. But this is the red mill that is now torn down. Pioneer Mill is there now. What I love, and he writes this short story about going over to buy paper. It's a beautiful short story. He's writing about these young girls with swords chopping up the rags and lint flying everywhere into their lungs. How can this be healthy? And the loud noise of the machinery. It's kind of, as somebody said earlier, like Dickens, writing about poverty and people struggling to survive. But this is what draws my attention. He's writing about going over the snow in his sled, in his pung. So this is my pung. Crunched and gritted over the vitreous, chippy snow as if it had been broken glass. We all know that sound, but he writes it in such a wonderful way. So this is, again, back to the map I want to show you, because he was admiring Greylock from a distance. When did he go to Greylock? First time I know is 1851, a year after he had been in Pittsfield. Did he go there as a young man when he came over in the summers? Quite possibly, but there's no record of it. And so in 1851, he gets a group together. The day before this group had gone out, Hawthorne included, over to Shaker Village. He invites Hawthorne to go back up to Greylock Mountain with him, and Hawthorne says he's exhausted. But he gets other people to go with him. And this is, they start here he goes from Arrowhead over to the Sarah Morewood's residence at the country club, picks her up. They head to the train station, the train depot. Then they take the train all the way up to North Adams. They get off the train in North Adams, and they think, oh, we'll just hire a couple of coaches. So, and there's about 8 of them, 10 of them. They're all there. They're all New Yorkers and Boston people. So imagine, you're a livery guy at the train station in North Adams. You see these New Yorkers coming. What do? You jack up the prices. And they were incensed, Melville and his group. And so they said, no, forget it, we'll walk. And so they head out. They break up into 2 different areas. One group, and I think this blue area is, there's Greylock. Oops. So one group goes over here, but they pick up a carriage, and Melville and company walk up from here. The rest of them, how do they meet up? Melville climbs a tree and starts screaming at people. Here I am, here I am. They spend the night at the top of Greylock. I should have put the list of food they brought with them. They could have fed an army. How did they carry this up there without, I think, pigs and dozens of bottles of champagne? And anyway, they're chopping wood. At the top of Greylock at the time was a wooden observatory tower. And it was for Williams College students. They spent the night there. There are 2 wonderful quotes from their night there. One was Augusta, Melville's sister, couldn't sleep because the rats were all over her at night. They were jumping on her. And apparently Sarah Morewood was a chatterbox because the editor, his friend Everett Dyker, saying, Morewood has killed my sleep. So the next morning they got up, they hope to see a good view, but as we all know, Greylock's fogged in. They just head back down. They get down back to North Adams on the way, they find another stage to take them the rest of the distance with all their belongings, and the guy drops them off probably a couple hundred yards from the train station. And so Melville says to him, no, you were supposed to take me to the train station. I'm taking you here. If you want me to take you there, it's going to cost a little more. And so Melville gets in this huge argument. He's arrested. The driver comes over, calls the sheriff over. And again, to me, I just thought of New Yorkers and Berkshire County residents meeting up. And Melville gets out of it, but his editor friend says, you should have seen the English thrown around, the language. So Melville, as far as I know, went up 4 more times. This was the one in 1851. He decided to go to North Adams. This time in 1852, the next year, he ascended from Adams, what we know as Adams, probably around the Thunderbolt Trail. 1853, I don't know where he went up from. Then he waited 1862. He went up with his sister's, with his wife's stepbrother, and they spent a couple of days up on Greylock. Well, he's got again a wonderful passage of climbing Greylock, and this was in the short story The Piazza. As I mentioned, he thought there was a fairy colony up there. So the narrator's saying, and when he's going up there, Melville returns to the sea. He's not in a carriage, it's yawl. Well, he does have a carriage, that's what he would use. And then again, you go up Greylock now, you're sure to see, fields of white weed, forget-me-nots, before you get to the deep woods. And then the rougher you get, the higher you go, the rougher it gets. You yourself are, as we hike up, footsore enough and weary. And finally you reach the first mountain, which is Saddle Ball. The taller brother is Greylock further on. But again, look at this. I don't want to read it for you, but you can get the sense of this cottage capped, nun-like, with a peaked roof. Beautiful. So here we are back at Arrowhead, and what I wanted to show you here is how did he get around? He wasn't wealthy, and yet he's taking people all over the place. He's driving around different carriages. We've heard about the pung. They do have a sleigh, and there's a famous anecdote in this biography that he grabs his family. They head over to Lenox to have tea with the Sedgwicks. And how to get to Lenox? They go up by the church on the hill, and they're in a horse with a sleigh. Down into Lenox. And obviously those sleds must have had some kind of brakes. But he terrified his sisters and insisted that he go back a different way. But this we know was his. It's a wood box, wood wagon, and what they would do is he would put benches in the wagon, and it could hold 10 or 11 people. And they went over to Dalton, up to Constitution Hill, over to Balance Rock. This was after he had lived there, and it looks like some kind of haying type of farm wagon. This was one that probably belonged to this man, his next door neighbor, because he had a collection of beautiful carriages. This was after Herman had lived there. But what they would do is they would go down to the depot in Pittsfield. There were livery barns, and they would rent a carriage for the day and a horse for the day. Melville, we know, had one horse. This horse, Charlie, an old horse. And this was the... I'll go in a little on this. Was what he drew would have been what he would have picked up at the train station and hired to take him home, a closed carriage. I guess they call it a phaeton or something. Aton. He rode his carriages so fast, his mother said Herman's in his chariot. And again, like you mentioned the Bible, his family says he drove like Jehu. Anybody? Jehu was the chariot commander for King Ahab, who drove his chariot so fast and so far. So one final quote I love. Why did Melville walk? He walked for physical exercise. I think he walked to compose, to think. I think he walked to get ideas. His descriptions of trees and how he uses trees and moss and flowers as reference points. You know, you could just see him. He brought visitors. He had two artist friends come to Arrowhead, and he took them up to the top of the hill here. And he said, you know what I do when I go on a walk? I pat the trees. Well, people think, oh, Melville was crazy by the end of his life, and that certainly sounds like a crazy man. Except when he's a writer. And so what do I think he's doing? He's observing the texture, how if he were to write about a tree like that, he would understand how the tree feels in his writing. And then this pardon me? He had he went to Europe in 1856 and he kept a journal, and that survived. Anything else? So he has a quote: "You find rare wisdom in the woods," and this is one of the trails I hike in Pittsfield State Forest. Any season, I try to get to this point with the view of Pontusic Lake there. There you have it. Thank you very much. And you know, while I'm doing this, I have to, what is this important? No, there must be, you know, where did Melville walk and wander in the Berkshires? Is it really important? In the grand scheme of things, probably not, except this is where we live, and you see where and how it inspired someone who had a genius for words, and what we see every day. He has helped us see it in a different light. So that's why I think it's important for me. Yes?
You said that he didn't make money off of Moby Dick initially. When did he start to make money?
Never. Never. He started to make money when he left Pittsfield and got a job 3 years after leaving here at the Customs House in New York. His wife inherited money, but they were scrimping by most of his life. He had some wealthy family members who helped him along the way, but no, his books were out of print, and he owed money. He had to pay people to publish, to pay people for the unused, unsold copies. So, yes?
His son actually had a mill here in Julia across the piece of tunnel. And when the father was in New York, published his books published, but anyway, but I'm sure that Dudley Melville, he had been in the paper, but this is the same time.
I did not know that the son was more, the father was a minister. The son was a lawyer and, pardon me? Well, Cyrus was a different field, and I'm not exactly sure which one he was, the brother of the son or the father, but Cyrus was the one who laid the first transatlantic cable. And two of the fields went on to become Supreme Court justices. So it was a very prominent, in fact, you know, in Stockbridge is that children's chime tower. That was put up by the son, called the Children's Tower, for his children, but it was really in honor of his father. Yeah, a little connection. I love it. Well, here's another connection. You won't believe this. I had a childhood friend when I grew up in Cincinnati. His name was Stephen Field Bidwell. So I get here, I see there's a Bidwell house. Oh, that Field. His brother's name was David Dudley Bidwell. So 2 years ago, I get an email through Ollie. Somebody's trying to get a hold of you from Vienna. Stephen Field Bidwell has found me on the Ollie website. And so now I've gotten in touch with my childhood friend. We just went to see him in Vienna. And talk about connections, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we do the backside of Monument Mountain, Black Rock. And there's a beautiful rock there. The green back beside where they had the meeting.
In the rain.
In the rain. It's much bigger than the overhang.
So I have yet to do that. And
Beautiful.
you afterwards tell me how you got there. Because there's people debate which side did they go up. You think it was the back? I've heard that before. It's a, I write a long part of the big chapter on Monument Mountain, the walk up, but I didn't know which way they went up. But for sure they could drive their carriages up farther than we can today. And there were 10 people on the hike, 8 of whom were writers. And something really magical happened that you had Oliver Wendell Holmes, Hawthorne, 2 editors, Cornelius Matthews, who was a writer as well. And they all wrote about this incredible day that they all knew something special had happened. And one person wrote, we climbed the mountain, we were rambling and scrambling, climbing and rhyming. I think that was Oliver Wendell Holmes. So, I don't think there were trails to the top, because he talks about 2 people going up, everybody going off up in their own direction. Rambling and scrambling, climbing and rhyming.